So you probably wonder why I was showing that little YouTube clip. I think there's various interpretations. One might say that if a puppy dog can learn to play a piano, anybody can learn ultrasound. Alternatively, one could say that the poor puppy was bemoaning the past, kind of like our faculty, bemoaning like, oh no, can we really move into this new era? But actually, the reason I showed this is because it is a viral video, right? When this went viral in 2010, it was everywhere. And so the goal is to get ultrasound to become viral. So I'm going to talk a little bit about faculty development, the gap, something that if we could overcome would help us become viral. I have no financial disclosure, but I do have a disclosure, and that is that I'm a hematologist and internist. So I really have to explain to you how I got to where I am, because I have no ultrasound experience. I think at least people can figure out that Dr. Hopman, who's a rheumatologist, may have gotten his rationale for ultrasound, but you can't even imagine a hematologist needing ultrasound, right? So how did this happen? The story goes somewhat like this. I spent many years chairing the American Board of Internal Medicine exams, working with an incredible group of wonderful professors, many of whom you would recognize as your trainers and educators. We did a lot of things. We got 9,000 questions validated, relevant, et cetera, et cetera. We changed the exams so that we didn't have to memorize things. We just thought that we tested things that were important. And when we all finished, we said, oh, let's have a little get together and say, gee, where do we go next and what should we pass on? And when we were brainstorming, we said, you know, there were all sorts of thoughts that maybe our next exam should be a clinical skills exam. After all, that's what Canada was doing. But the reality was we were all disheartened because we said, that's great that people can pass an exam. But we all round on the wards, we all see patients with our residents, and we know that they do not practice what they say the answers are on the exam. So how could we actually get our patients and our physicians back together? And how could we really make a difference? And so that was actually in 2004. And in this group of national experts, a nephrologist piped up and said, well, why don't we do ultrasound? Everybody else is doing it, like an OBGYN. Why can't we do it? That was 2004. It took me about 4 years to think about how we might go forward. And by about 2008, I was able to convince Sonosite that this was a good idea. A crazy idea, but a good idea. So I began to look at the literature and call around. And sure enough, I think I looked at Michael Blavis because he had published so much and it was all emergency. And he said, oh, you know, there's this great guy, Dick Hopman, who's doing it with medical students. And so we put together a consensus group, or a listening group it was called, of about 30 individuals who were doing something in ultrasound. ER, John Kendall came, I think you were out of the country. That's where I met Dick for the first time. And we brought some internists in to listen. President of the American College, President of the American Board of Internal Medicine, leaders of the ACGME, thought leaders throughout all of internal medicine to listen to this. I actually had 3 people who said, no, this is too crazy. We're not even going to think about it, so we won't even come, even though you're paying us. So that was in 2008. And I actually thought that we were just really at the beginning, only to find out. I'm not sure what's, are you moving my slides or am I moving them? Okay. That there actually was somebody who had thought about this, because as you know, there's usually no single idea. So during that meeting, I learned about a cardiologist named Dr. Bruce Kimura, who had trained at UCSD in one of the premier echocardiography programs in the country. When he left UCSD, he went across the street to a community-based program in private practice, still committed to academics. And he learned at that time that wow, I'm getting all these referred echoes that I really don't need to do and I don't need to see. Can't we teach residents to do a test on their patients that would improve their outcome? So he began all the way back in 1998 to do this. And by 2010, 2013, now he has a number of classes that have graduated. And he really has, I think, the only residency in the country that has now graduated residents in internal medicine that have some ultrasound competency. So where are we? We need to get beyond just in the ER, the emergency room, those who have led the way to show point-of-care ultrasound. We need to be more than just a few schools and more than only a few residencies. We really need to move clinical skills for all. So to do this, we need faculty, of course, and you've heard this repeatedly. We have large numbers of providers in training. When you think about the medical schools, we are now graduating 19,000 students per year. We have 25,000 GME residents, up to 100,000 residents in training at any one time. We have nurses everywhere that are advanced practice providers, PAs, et cetera, et cetera. Yet we only have about 90 ER fellowship programs and only one internal medicine fellowship program that I know of, an ultrasound based right here. So the other thing that we know is that the data always show us that we practice what we learn in school. It takes a long time to move away from how we trained. So that's why it's critical to begin early. So to make meaningful change, we can't wait until there are enough formally trained faculty. We really need to move forward, and we need individuals who are not just of the newly graduated techies, but we need some of us gray hairs to actually learn this skill and understand where it fits in our future. So, what are the challenges for faculty development? We already heard about the non-believers. I brought some deans to visit South Carolina, and I thought, well, this is a good approach. I'll pay for them to come, they'll be all excited, and they looked at me leaving, oh, you really drank the Kool-Aid, didn't you? And I said, well, I helped create the Kool-Aid, right? So, there are difficulties not only in the specialties, but I think in the faculty milieu, so that it takes a fair amount to move it forward. Furthermore, our current ultrasound practitioners have specialized foci, so they've stepped away from what a generalist needs to know or what basic clinical skills are, so that if you're talking about an anesthesiologist who knows ultrasound for nerve block, they still need education if they're going to teach basic skills. We also, as we've heard, do not have a well-accepted integrated curriculum that we can easily pick up that is evidence-based and that we can put into our schools. And we have a new technical skill we need to learn, so the content is easy. We can do that online. That's something you can actually learn. But we need this hand-eye coordination and the practice to obtain the image. That's a new, different kind of challenge. And therefore, we also need space and machines. So today, I'd just like to say a few things about three basic objectives. One is, what are strategies to recruit faculty or to get faculty on board? What can we do to remove barriers for faculty development? And finally, what opportunities exist to reward faculty? So how do we find a critical mass of believers? We look for faculty who already use ultrasound, ER, anesthesia, vascular, OBGYN, cardiology, sports medicine, and of course, radiology. We create the need to develop faculty. I think that this is an important thought process, which is when you look at what we are currently doing and what is required in the hospital, the one piece of evidence, okay, that all national organizations will agree to is that for neophytes in central lines, the indication is for ultrasound guidance. So if you need an indication to build faculty, there's one that even the hospitals can buy in. You look at the ACGME requirements. Again, I think that you can find faculty if you can find the ACGME requirements that require those faculty. And finally, you can have a simple clinical correlation day in the student curriculum, and that will push the edge. You can actually create a new critical mass of believers. Students are great at pushing administration. I think that would refer to people like us, to move in directions. And I think that there are things you can do. One of the things we did was we had a global health day for the whole Northwest. Lots of students. We had our ultrasound machine out there. We now have some electives, and I think electives are very popular ways to get students involved. So I think once the students have hands-on, they will also help push. I think it's important to mentor somebody. The skill is a new skill. They can acquire it that will differentiate them and add to their teaching armamentarium. So whether this is a senior radiologist who's going to find a clinician and help them go along their way, or whether it's actually somebody who's just out of their ER fellowship and is going to mentor a fourth-year student. Again, I think that you can spread your wealth. There's lots of advantages to this. If you are a teacher on the ward and you now have a fancy-dancy tool in your hand, you become rapidly known, very popular educator, and the students and residents will again flock to you, and you'll end up by being Teacher of the Year. I think we've seen that repeatedly by people who talk up here, that they have made that level of contribution. And finally, there is a plethora of research and education questions to be answered. So this really is a new career path for someone, especially in a generalist field. And finally, it's important to create peer educators. As we know, even when we look in flipped classrooms and the day when we have small groups, students we know learn very well from peers. So do residents, so do actually faculty. So that adding peer educators are critical. And I would say adding ultrasound technicians to faculty has been helpful in 2 instances where I've attempted this. Here's an example of some new faculty that are just coming out. This is a result of the cardiology program that I was talking about. It's the CLUE curriculum. When you see these residents, you can see how many patients they've used their applications on. They are ready to go and teach the next generation. And I think that as you go through creating an esprit among these graduates and people with the same skills is critical to moving the next generation ahead. It's interesting in that when you look at this program, they've really gotten on board since they've built this image competition where they have big trophies, and now it's become just part of their training program. I think it's also important to try to create a community. There are lots of different ways to do this, to identify a group where you now become committed to one goal, a group across, I think, what has previously been silos. Silos of departments, usually. You can do it in Ultrasound Institute. We are actually creating an interprofessional faculty across all of our schools, and ultrasound faculty are part of that. You can create a group of faculty that can teach across departments and electives. You can have interest groups. You can use your simulation faculty. You see this, you probably recognize somebody in this picture, and that is on the left-hand side is Dr. John Ma, the editor of the Ultrasound ER book. But this is a pretty diverse group. This is how we're starting at OHSU. We have the Ultrasound Fellowship Director, a professor in OBGYN, a professor in critical care, and a junior faculty in general internal medicine. This group is now tripled in the last couple of years. Engaging in academic activities, grand rounds, site visits to other places, having people visit you, attending national meetings like this one, journal clubs, curriculum groups, research groups, anything you can do to create esprit de corps and a community. What about the barriers to faculty development? Probably the number one barrier is time. How do you find time to learn a new skill? What tools are available to help us? And finally, how do we find patients and machines and space? How much time does it actually take, and what do we know about that? A few years ago, one of the outgrowths of the conference that we had was to train hospitalists in cardiac ultrasound. And the reality was there were no good data on how much experience and time it takes to actually become competent. And we didn't even know what the definition of competence was. Here you see Bruce, who has now had years of experience, showing about how long it takes his residents for a commitment. He estimates that it's about 50 hours of book learning time or web-based time. About 60 cases, 30 of which are proctored, right? And engagement in other kinds of practice activity. I would say that my ultrasound tech judged me competent after 24 cardiacs. So to get an idea how long it takes, this is not a horrific commitment, and for us who are older, it's probably longer than others. But I think it's fair to say that while we look at this assessment of competence, really the problem is very different, which is it is not about learning the picture of the image. It's something very different for us. Of course, you all know this, but it's getting the image. And so that's why we really need to figure out how to overcome that obstacle for those of us who are neophytes. So who has time to learn a new skill? What I would say is that, if we wait to have it perfect, we won't get there. I think we learned this the hard way. I actually spent about a year and a half trying to do a clinical trial to prove that it was important that we learn this skill. I've given up on that tactic. And I've taken this other tactic, which is, I think you heard about the TED Talk from Mitra. If those of you who have not listened to it, this is a truly inspirational TED Talk, where he just gave access to kids' computers, right? And they learned. Well, actually, that's been my current philosophy, to give access to people who want to use the machine. So I think that the message I have is, do not have the curriculum be perfect before you start it. Do not have all the machines be perfect before you start it. Do not go through every curriculum committee. Kind of just let it happen. That'll diffuse it from both ends. The other way to think about this is, if you've done an M.B.A., you know about the Arizona iced tea, which is the way they've never marketed before they became number one. They just put it out there. And people began to see it and use it. And it was accessible because it was so cheap. So I think that that is one approach. If you're trying to find who really wants to use it, who wants to do it, that's one approach. Clearly not everyone will be able to learn these skills. The hand-eye coordination is clearly very different among individuals. And that's something that has to be understood. And finally, if you want to find time, it's important to find ways to link this to the work that people are already doing. This is a great example of just putting a machine in a hospital, a young hospitalist's hand at our place. I remember when I got this call, oh, it's so exciting. We were on rounds and we found this embolus, and lo and behold, we found it on the formal ultrasound also. Great Janeway lesion, great vegetation. We would never expect that to be critical for somebody's skill, which is to find a vegetation. But the fact that she had it in her hand and was able to find it made everybody great believers. What about everybody getting to it at the same time? Will everybody actually like this? I made the irrational assumption that people would just love this if they were on the ward as hospitalists. It's actually not true. Some people don't ever want to touch the machine. And other people have a much harder time to get to competence. Here again is Bruce's experience over time. Sure, the curriculum got better, but it's clear that not everybody will attain the same level of competence at the same time. And furthermore, if you look at his data, competence in ultrasound did not correlate with competence on his board rates. So clearly it's a different skill set. This is just to remind me that we did this pretty easily thanks to Bill Cameron, who is our chair of anatomy, who actually came to Dick's Place last spring. This is our recent, just last week, first-year anatomy course, showing a pulmonary critical care faculty teaching, an anesthesiologist teaching, and peer teaching going on, and a mixed group of PAs, first-year medical students, and radiation technicians. Next year, actually, because we've managed to put all 14 of our curricular time schedules together, in other words, we've changed all of our start and end times, we actually will have the School of Dentistry learning anatomy with us among our other schools and our advanced practice nurses. So at some point, we'll have 800 students all at once, all being able to integrate into a new learning methodology. We clearly need peer teachers, student users, who again became super users in a matter of minutes. In this particular first go-around of stations, students had the probe in their hand 2 minutes per station. And that is literally the only time they had. They really got it. It was just striking to see how excited and how easy they were able to integrate anatomy with the visualization. I don't know why we're going. So what about tools available to help? This is just actually an advertisement for why SESME came to be, right? Society of Ultrasound and Medical Education. So great websites we already know about. You heard about FOAMed yesterday, which is an amazing site. We now have the opportunity to publish in the JUM, in particular SESME section, and that is a unique opportunity for faculty to develop. And finally, we have lots of colleagues and friends in SESME, any of whom I'm sure would love to be called about what they're doing and the help they can provide. This is, again, another site. This is actually how I learned my cardiac ultrasound. This is Bruce's site, and I only show this because there's lots of sites. Everybody's got their own site that's useful. But what's great about this is that it not only has the education part, it has, I need help right now. I have the earplugs in. Help me with this. You can see that you can actually read it, watch it, do it, and quiz it. So it's a totally self-contained site. Just one more example of the kinds of tools that we need to do and have available for faculty to develop. So what about access to patients and machines for practice? I would just say that there are lots of ways to get these skills. One of the ways is to actually schedule time in ultrasound labs anywhere. You can get lots of experience, lots of hands-on, and a quick time frame. You can actually round with ultrasound technicians. In other words, I've had my hospitalists go around with an ultrasound technician and follow them right afterwards, get checked. They can get checked off pretty rapidly. And the ultrasonographers are very skilled at helping neophytes through this. We certainly work on normal students, standardized patients. Got to have space for that. Got to set it up. Sometimes you can tag along after your medical school OSCEs. We clearly have clinical simulation labs with task trainers. We know about that. But I want to address this other problem, the ultrasound simulator for acquiring the technical skill. Actually, here you see a PA student on a blue Phantom. But here's what I meant by the ultrasound simulator, which is, for those of you who do ultrasound, which is probably everybody in this room, remember, I don't do ultrasound. So I have to figure out how to use my hand with that probe. If I have to spend all that time erratically every once in a while seeing a patient, or every once in a while figuring out that I'm going to do this skill today, I can't really advance on my own time when I am free. I can't do this during my workday. I can't do it when patients are not available or when a lab's not open. But here you see something that I can do, which is play with that probe and actually have a different kind of simulator. So we know about the task trainers, but this is actually the SonoSim, which you see our critical care faculty teaching one of the fellows on. But it's great because you can access it 24/7. You don't have to wait until everything's available. So what about space? I would actually say space is important, but it's really the machines that are important, having access and the ability to get those machines. I think you can integrate it into your other spaces. We've clearly put it right next door to our anatomy labs. You can put it in your simulation labs, and you can put it in your hospital training sites. I think the faculty have to be able to access on their own time frame. If you want to develop a faculty, they got to get that practice. Can't be on patients, and it has to fit their own schedule. There clearly needs to be virtual components that are both asynchronous and synchronous. I mean, I think a lot of what we talk about is asynchronous. Here's a website, et cetera, but the ability to have coaching at the time you're using it is critically important. So this is my show for next year, which is we are putting it throughout all of our simulation centers. This is our new collaborative life sciences building. On the left is an education building, and on floors 3 and 4 will be our simulation center, which will include ultrasound. I might add that I was also lucky in selecting 3 SIM co-directors, all of whom have ultrasound in their background. One's critical care, one's OBGYN, and one's a vascular surgeon. So not only will they lead simulation, which they are currently doing, they are now adding ultrasound to their armamentarium. So next year, we will have this building available. And this will be the human mannequin simulated environments. You can see the hospital simulated in this area, including an ER transfer space. But we will also have a very large simulated clinical skills room for nurses, PAs, doctors, dentists, and we'll have many, 20 to be exact, exam rooms that will have access both in video, and many of them we hope will have ultrasound machines in there. So what about opportunities to reward faculty? I think you've already heard people mention the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act really is now about global budgeting, right? So when we're out of fee-for-service, it becomes much more appropriate and important to be able to care for our patients at the point of care, to decrease the cost for ordering tests, et cetera, et cetera. Furthermore, though, I think most physicians are referring to the triple aim as something that they really see as core to what they do. Improving the quality of care for patients, which does include decreasing the radiation, I might add, right? Decreasing the cost and improving the patient experience. So if we just think about that, most physicians and most providers can truly be motivated by that. But I would also say that this is a great time with this technique and this new field to get a lot of student and resident accolades. It's the fuzzy part, feel good for why we teach, right? Additionally, usually the early adopters are people who have a lot of intrinsic motivation. When you think about why we work, there's been lots of study about what makes us happy in work. It's not the money, right? It's not being easy. It's actually making progress or making a difference. So there's a lot of intrinsic motivation, and faculty then itself is rewards. After all, if you've been doing the same thing for years and years, doing something different, making it better is really important to faculty. course, there is an academic identity. I suspect that there will be a group of faculty who make their careers in this in the future. So getting faculty early on is critically important because they really can develop in this regard. So I think that if you were going to think about it, you could figure out where you might put this cluster of faculty in your educational enterprise. Yes, there's some money that's needed, but it's not all about money. It's easy enough to send junior faculty to conferences to provide a little bit of salary offset, you know, if it's 1/10 of a time or 0.2 of a time, or to help them get a grant. So through all of this, why do we need faculty? What is our long-term goal? It is truly to advance clinical skills in all of our healthcare curriculums, right, through the point of care ultrasound. So we want this to go viral. We need lots of faculty. We truly cannot do a research agenda until we have faculty. That has become very clear to me. As I told you the story of trying to do the research first to prove that was valid and important to do, I think this is an opportunity that we have to take in the other direction. Yes, we may have drunk the Kool-Aid, we may be true believers, but I also look at it this way. There is no harm produced by ultrasound. We aren't good at what we do now. We know that our clinical skills are less than 50% accurate, and we know that everything that we do in its place is more expensive and more invasive for the patient, or doesn't help the patient. So I think that we need to get to the research agenda, but it's critical to have the faculty, enough people with enough skill to be able to do and answer the questions. And of course, the research agenda has to do with what is the impact on patient outcomes and what are the best ways to obtain competence in the skills that we think are important. And finally, what is the ultimate point? Point of care ultrasound our goal should be to have providers everywhere be expected to have these clinical skills, whether they are advanced nurse practitioners, PAs, physicians. This, when you think about it, is a skill that everybody can acquire. So, you know, we've often heard that in the future, we won't need healthcare providers. We'll just be able to take care of ourselves over a computer with a healthcare provider. On the left, I think that's not far away from when I trained, and it looks pretty familiar because it comes from the same hallways I trained in. But the reality is, it's trainees around a bedside with a patient. That's no different than it is today. We are still going to be surrounding a patient as we learn and as we care for a patient. So, is it not important to rethink what our clinical skills are? What is the black bag of the 21st century? It is certainly not the black bag of the 20th century. And what are the requirements for general ultrasound clinical skills? Yes, we want it evidence-based as much as possible, but it's never going to be perfect. We need to have some clear targets for what we're doing. And whatever we do has to be time efficient, can't extend what we do with our patients because we know that we'll never get it diffused out if that's the case. We need to understand the learning curve. We need to understand basic ultrasound and what the bedside applications are. So I hope next year you will join us in Portland for the Third World Congress. And I would say, if you read the first paragraph, at OHSU, host of next year's Congress, big ideas come in all shapes and sizes. You can see one of the big ideas is the tram, which is how we commute between our lower and upper campus. But I think ultrasound is our next big idea. Through you, hopefully will make an impact next year. So if you are interested in participating, if you have ideas for the program, anything, please feel free to contact us. You can reach us right there, and we hope that we will see you all next year. and bring your friends and colleagues and more faculty then. So thank you.